The auction yard smelled of dust, sweat, and old leather when the bidding began. The afternoon sun hung low over the small frontier town, turning everything the color of burnt copper. Horses stamped restlessly inside wooden pens while flies buzzed around their eyes. Men in wide-brimmed hats leaned against the fence rails, their boots grinding against dry dirt, their voices low and casual as if the business of buying and selling life was just another ordinary chore. For Daniel Carter, it almost was. He had spent most of his life drifting from ranch to ranch, working cattle, fixing fences, and sleeping under open skis. The small ranch he now owned sat miles outside town and barely made enough money to keep him going. A good pair of horses could change that. Good horses meant hauling supplies, checking distant grazing fields, maybe even driving cattle for extra pay. That was why he stood quietly near the back of the auction yard, his hands resting on the top rail of the fence. He didn't talk much, never had. People usually forgot he was there. The auctioneer stood on a raised crate in the center of the yard, his red vest soaked with sweat. He waved a rolled-up list in the air and shouted over the noise. Next lot, 2 desert mustangs caught near the southern range. 2 horses were dragged into the open pen by a young stable boy. They were lean and dusty, their ribs faintly visible beneath rough coats, but their legs were strong and their eyes were bright with stubborn spirit. Daniel studied them closely. Most men saw skinny horses and lost interest. Daniel saw endurance. Mustangs like these could run all day across harsh desert ground. They were hard to break, but once trained they were loyal and nearly impossible to kill. Exactly the kind of horses a poor rancher needed. The auctioneer slapped one of the horses on its flank. Strong animals, tough as iron. Who will start the bidding at $20? A rancher near the front lifted 2 fingers lazily. 20. 20 I got, the auctioneer shouted. Do I hear 25? Another voice came from the side. 25. Daniel hesitated. His entire savings sat folded inside his pocket. $35. If he spent most of it now, he'd have little left for supplies. But chances like this didn't come often. He raised his hand. 30. The auctioneer pointed immediately. $30. A few men turned to look back at him. Some smirked. A quiet cowboy bidding was always worth a glance. 35, the auctioneer called. Silence. The ranchers near the front exchanged glances, then shrugged. The horses looked too wild for most buyers. The auctioneer grinned. Sold. He slammed the gavel against the crate. Daniel stepped forward as the stable boy opened the pen gate. The mustangs tossed their heads but didn't resist much as they were led toward him. Then something shifted in the shadow behind them. At first Daniel thought it was another horse. But then a figure stepped forward. A woman. A ripple of murmurs spread across the crowd. She walked slowly into the sunlight, her hands tied loosely with rope. Long black hair hung in a thick braid down her back, and dust clung to the torn fabric of her dress. Her face was calm, though her dark eyes scanned the crowd with quiet intensity. The auctioneer barely glanced at her. Oh, that one, he said casually, waving his hand. Don't worry about her. A few men laughed. She's an Apache woman picked up outside town. Nobody wanted to bid on her earlier. The laughter grew louder. The auctioneer shrugged. Consider her part of the deal, free with the horses. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. The woman didn't react to the insults or the laughter. She stood straight, her shoulders proud, her expression unreadable. For a moment her eyes met Daniel's. There was no fear in them, just sharp awareness. Daniel stepped closer to the auctioneer. You mean she comes with the horses? He asked quietly. The man nodded, amused. That's right, Cowboy, you bought the lot. More laughter broke out from the crowd. Some of the men found the situation funny. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. On the frontier, people learned quickly that certain things were better ignored. Daniel's gaze drifted across the yard. That was when he noticed them. 3 men stood apart from the others near the far fence. They weren't laughing. They weren't talking. They were watching. Their coats were long and travel-worn, and each of them wore a revolver low on his hip. One of the men pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. He opened it slowly. Even from across the yard, Daniel recognized the shape. A wanted poster. The man glanced at the paper, then lifted his eyes toward the woman. A slow smile spread across his face. Daniel felt a chill slide down his spine. This wasn't about a free woman nobody wanted. This was something else entirely. The Apache woman looked toward the same men. For just a moment, her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. Then her eyes flicked back toward Daniel. It happened so quickly most people would have missed it. But Daniel saw it clearly. A warning. The rope around her wrists was barely tied. It looked more like an insult than a real restraint. Without speaking, Daniel reached forward and untied the knot. The rope slipped away and fell into the dirt. Several men nearby raised their eyebrows. "You sure you want to do that?" someone muttered. Daniel ignored them. The woman flexed her wrist slightly but said nothing. He handed the stable boy a few coins for the horses and took their reins. "Mount up," he said quietly to her. She hesitated only a second before swinging onto one of the mustangs with surprising grace. The crowd grew quieter now. Something about the moment had shifted. The laughter had faded. Daniel climbed onto the second horse and adjusted the reins. As he turned toward the gate, he could feel eyes following him, especially the 3 men by the fence. One of them stepped closer to the others and tapped the wanted poster with a gloved finger. Daniel couldn't hear what they said, but he saw the number printed in bold black ink across the page. $10,000. A fortune. More money than most men in that yard would ever see. The man folded the poster slowly. The 3 of them began walking toward their horses. Daniel guided the mustangs through the gate and onto the dusty street outside the auction yard. The Apache woman rode beside him silently. For several minutes, they moved through town without speaking. Shopkeepers watched from their doorways. A few townsfolk whispered to each other as they passed. Daniel could feel tension building like a storm in the air. Finally, they reached the edge of town, where the road stretched out into the wide desert. Only then did the woman speak. "You should not have taken me," she said quietly. Her voice was calm but firm. Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon. "Didn't seem right leaving you there." "They will come for me," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "I figured as much." Behind them, faint hoofbeats echoed in the distance. He glanced back over his shoulder. 3 riders had just left town. They rode hard, and they were heading straight for them. Daniel faced forward again. The wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush across the open land. He exhaled slowly. A few hours ago, he had come to town hopping to buy 2 cheap horses. Instead, he had just ridden away with the most hunted woman in the territory. And judging by the speed of those riders behind them, the bounty hunters were already on his trail. The sun was already sinking behind the red desert hills when Daniel Carter finally slowed the horses. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by a cooler wind that whispered through the dry grass and scattered sagebrush. Long shadows stretched across the rocky ground as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. Daniel guided the mustangs into a narrow canyon that cut through the hills like a hidden passage. Tall rock walls rose on both sides, blocking the wind and hiding the trail from anyone riding across the open plains. It was the kind of place, A man chose when he needed time to think. He dismounted slowly, tying the horses to a low branch of a twisted mesquite tree. The animals snorted and shook their heads, still restless from the long ride out of town. The Apache woman slid off her horse with quiet grace. Her movements were steady, controlled, as if exhaustion had no hold over her at all. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The silence of the canyon felt heavy but peaceful. Somewhere high above them, a hawk cried out as it circled the fatting sky. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Those men back at the auction," he said, keeping his voice low, "they weren't just curious buyers." The woman turned slightly toward him, her dark eyes studying his face. "No," she said, "they were hunters." Daniel nodded. He had already guessed as much. The way they had stared at her, the wanted poster, the quiet confidence in their expressions, those were the signs of men who made their living chasing people. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if deciding whether he could be trusted. Then she answered, "Yana." Daniel tipped his hat slightly. "Daniel Carter." Yana looked around the canyon carefully, studying the high ridges and narrow entrance like someone who had spent her life reading the land. "They will follow us," she said calmly. "Men who hunt for money do not give up easily." Daniel knelt beside his saddlebag and pulled out a small canteen. He took a drink before offering it to her. She accepted it with a quiet nod. "Why are they hunting you?" he asked. Yana drank slowly, then handed the canteen back. For a moment she seemed lost in thought, as if deciding how much of the truth to reveal. Finally, she reached beneath the torn fabric of her dress and pulled out something hidden against her side. A folded piece of paper. She held it carefully, almost reverently, before handing it to him. Daniel frowned and opened it. The paper was official, thick, and stamped with dark government seals. Lines and markings covered the page, outlining large sections of land across the desert territory. His eyes widened as he read the signatures. "This is a land deed," he said quietly. Yana nodded. "Land promised to settlers and tribes," she explained. "Land the railroad companies were never meant to own." Daniel looked closer. The document listed thousands of acres stretching across valuable rail routes and water sources. "And you have proof they stole it?" he asked. "My father worked with the white surveyors many winters ago," Yana said softly. "He was a translator. He helped them speak with the tribes when they came to measure the land." Daniel listened carefully. "Before he died," she continued, "he discovered the truth. Powerful men changed the records. They took land meant for many people and sold it to the railroad barons." She gestured toward the paper. "This document shows the original claim. It proves the land was stolen." Daniel exhaled slowly. Now the bounty made sense. $10,000 wasn't being offered for a runaway Apache woman. It was being offered for silence. "If this reaches the governor in Santa Fe," Yana said, "those men lose everything." Daniel folded the document carefully. "And they can't let that happen." Yana shook her head. "They have already killed others who knew." A cold wind moved through the canyon, rattling the dry branches of the mesquite tree. Daniel suddenly felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had only meant to buy horses. Now he was holding proof that could destroy some of the most powerful men in the territory. And 3 bounty hunters were already riding after them. Just then, Ayana lifted her head slightly. Her eyes focused toward the canyon entrance. Daniel followed her gaze. At first he heard nothing. Then faintly, carried on the evening wind, came the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats. Slow. Steady. Getting closer. "They found us," Daniel muttered. He stood up and walked toward the canyon opening. 3 riders appeared against the fading light of the horizon. The same men from the auction yard. They rode calmly, without hurry, like men who already knew how the story would end. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, they stopped. The leader tipped his hat slightly. "Well now," he called out with a lazy grin, "that didn't take long." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and Ayanna. The bounty hunter's eyes flicked toward her. "There she is," he said. One of the other men chuckled. $10,000, he added, "alive if possible." The leader shrugged. "Dead if necessary." Daniel's hand rested near his revolver, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "You boys should turn around," he said calmly. The riders laughed. The leader leaned forward in his saddle. "Cowboy, you look like a reasonable man. This doesn't have to end badly for you." Daniel didn't answer. "You didn't know what you were buying at that auction," the bounty hunter continued, "but now you do." He pointed toward Ayanna. "She's worth more money than that little ranch of yours will ever see." Daniel felt a flicker of anger rise inside him. Behind him, Ayanna stepped closer. "You can still leave," she said quietly. "Take the horses and ride away. This is not your fight." Daniel stared at the riders. For most of his life, he had done exactly that, avoided trouble, stayed quiet, kept his head down. Life on the frontier taught a man that survival often meant walking away. But something about the way the men had laughed when Ayanna was treated like property at the auction, something about the calm strength in her voice now, made walking away feel impossible. He reached into his coat and placed the folded document safely inside. Then he stepped forward. "You want her," Daniel said. The leader smiled. "That's right." Daniel slowly rested his hand on the grip of his revolver. "Then you'll have to come through me." For a moment the canyon fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The bounty hunters looked at each other, amused. One of them shook his head. "3 against 1, he said. "Those aren't good odds." Daniel's eyes hardened. "I've worked cattle all my life," he replied quietly. "Means I'm used to dealing with stubborn animals." The leader's smile faded slightly. He studied Daniel more carefully now. Something had changed. The quiet cowboy no longer looked like an easy obstacle. He looked like a man who had already decided how this would end. The bounty hunter slowly reached for his gun. "Last chance," he warned. Daniel didn't move. Behind him, Ayanna watched silently. The first gun cleared its holster. And a split second later, the canyon exploded with the deafening crack of gunfire, echoing violently off the rock walls as dust and smoke filled the air. The battle for the truth and for Ayanna's life had begun.